Hey everyone, Joshua Kirk here with you once again, and I'm doing another list video here. I am going to be going over 14 albums in 2018 that I really liked, that I feel are some of the most underrated or overlooked albums of 2018. Now, some of these records may have gotten some critical acclaim, but not really as much press or attention as they may have deserved. These are all just my own opinion. So I'm basically kind of giving some shout outs to albums that definitely I highly recommend you don't sleep on them, because they're all such great records. So anyway, let's get right to it. And I'm doing all of these in order of when they were released in 2018. Starting with JPEGMAFIA's sophomore record, Veteran. This is by far one of the best experimental hip-hop records of the year. Definitely one of the most creative I've heard. But also definitely one of the most aggressive and politically charged experimental records I've heard this year too. I mean, he takes shots on this record at white supremacy and stuff like that, and all of that. And he even disses Morrissey on one track that I think is just hilarious. Whereas most rappers would be dissing another rapper, in this case he disses the kind of controversial frontman for the Smiths. This album has received some praise from Pitchfork and The Needle Drop and a few others, but I feel that this record, still doesn't really get the credit that it really deserves. He really is such a talented rapper and a very inventive producer as well, so I definitely recommend you check that out. And he's from my neck of the woods, Baltimore, Maryland. Next, I want to give a shout out to the new MGMT album, Little Dark Age. I recently did a review for this record. A really good sort of return to form from the band that, of course, is pretty famous for the songs Electric Feel, Time to Pretend, and Kids off their debut album. But they really are the kind of band that's always kind of wanted to do their own thing and didn't want a corporation telling them what to do, which is why they literally expanded upon their debut with a much more ambitious record, Congratulations. Then they put out a very critically panned sort of self-titled record, but now they're back with, by far, I think, probably their best album to date. Great hooks on this thing, fantastic songwriting, really cool production. It really does show it's the perfect balance between the band's catchy, accessible side and their more ambitious, sort of weirder side too. So this is definitely a record that definitely, deserves a little more attention at this point, even though it did get pretty solid reviews overall. And then next, this one is probably one of the most polarizing rock records of the year, so it definitely, I think, makes sense for this list. It's the new Jack White album, Boarding House Reach. Didn't like this album the first time I heard it, but then it's really grown on me as I've sort of found this record to be very refreshing in comparison to his more kind of underwhelming last couple solo records. It definitely is by far his most experimental, I think, but it also, I think, really does show some of his strongest guitar work on here. I mean, there's some really sick solos throughout this record. Take a look at songs like Corporation or Respect Commander. That solo at the end is just killer. And also really to show that and this also really does show that Jack White, and this is definitely Jack White very much making the kind of album he wants to make. So it isn't totally unexpected for him to just go all out and create this really incredible sort of blues rock hodgepodge of a record. record. It's definitely, not for everybody, but it most certainly is one that I highly recommend. And then after that, shout out to Neko Case for her new record, Hell On. This is her first solo album in about 5 years, because in between she's sort of been busy on other projects. For example, the new Pornographers put out a couple of records during this time, and also she was on that excellent Case Langvers project. With this new record of hers, I think she really sort of went back to her roots a little bit, making by far her most emotionally intense album in years. And this is, I definitely do think, people definitely seem to be loving this album for the most part, but it hasn't really been getting as much praise, or, but it hasn't really, hasn't really been getting as much sort of attention as, say, Fox Confessor Brings the Flood, which is like her big breakthrough. And she's definitely put out, I think, her most successful record to date. But she's sort of creating these very kind of heart-rending sort of vignettes here on this album. I mean, it's definitely a record that took a lot of courage for her to put together, but it definitely does show itself off as some of her best songs in over a decade. And then after that, the collaboration between Kanye West and Kid Cudi, that is Kids See Ghosts. Of course, the one Kanye West related album from 2018 that everyone seems to be hyping up about is Daytona, which that is a great album, but Kids See Ghosts, I think, really stood out. And matter of fact, I think I actually like it better than Daytona even. But it's my favorite rap album of the year. I mean, I would have never thought to enjoy a project that has Kid Cudi in it in 2018, but he really has improved, I think. I mean, I heard that he got sober, so I think that sort of is part of his improvements. I mean, he still sounds like kind of the forlorn Cudi that we're all familiar with, but this time he sounds much more compelling on here over like Kanye West's very creative sample choices on here. And they have some great chemistry together, I would say. Like, Kanye is very kind of like wild and in your face, but then Cudi is just so dejected and kind of very melancholy, but this time like in a good way, I think. In a good way, I think. I mean, it definitely showed that like, I definitely do recommend that album for sure. And then after that, we have probably my favorite underground hip-hop album of the year, Marlowe, the collaboration between L'Orange and Solemn Brigham. Definitely a great sort of project coming out of Mellow Music Group. Featuring some of the most creative and gorgeous samples I've heard in some like indie rap this year. And Brigham's verses and flows really do fit with the samples really well. I mean, and the album flow is really cool too. I really like how it sort of feels a little bit like a film a little bit, and features these really cool kind of spoken word kind of bits intertwining the whole record together. And stuff like that. Like that. And it definitely... So, I mean, I would actually really like to hear like another project from like both of these people together, even though you don't necessarily need that, I think, after an album like this, because otherwise it would kind of feel a bit more rushed in comparison to this one, which sounds, I think, very inspired. So that's why it was so high on my year-end list for 2018. And then next you have Tony Molina with Kill the Lights, the San Francisco-based singer-songwriter, sort of departs from his punk roots on this record in place for a much more melodic and much sort of polished sound, which definitely takes some of its influence from like some jangle pop and like psychedelic sort of pop. I mean, this pretty much is kind of a revival of, kind of that time period when psychedelia, met pop and created, a style that some of us would call power pop. And get this, the album itself is only 14 minutes across 10 songs, and yet it still feels like a fully fleshed out project and not just some half-baked ideas. That's sort of the talent that I find most admirable about Tony Molina. His ability to make sort of tracks that only last for like over a minute or a minute and a half still feel like fully fleshed out songs and not just interludes. Something he did with his debut album, Dissed and Dismissed, which was literally 12 songs in 12 minutes. And this record certainly is a bit longer, but still, it's definitely the kind of record where I highly recommend you check it out. Definitely deserves a little more respect. Just enjoy, just be able to enjoy the moment while you're listening to it, because it will end soon before you know it. And then a shout out to Denzel Curry for putting out one of my favorite hip-hop records of the year, Taboo. This is following up his 2016 album, Imperial, but I feel that this record, should be his breakthrough, because it is definitely, I think, by far probably the best I've heard from him. It is a little bit of a concept album. Taboo is sort of like this kind of character he creates on this record, who is just willing to like change the rap game, but it's not super campy. It feels still like just a really good, strong hip-hop record with killer production, fantastic flows, really good features on here too, which JPEGMAFIA, whom I just mentioned earlier, does show up on one track here. Here, as well as people like JID, Billie Eilish, and Nigeria, as well. It's definitely a record that I definitely highly recommend this album, because he's really got this very kind of ferocious sort of personality that very few young rappers manage to deliver. But it is really refreshing to hear this very kind of in-your-face, kind of to-the-point sort of rap in this age where a lot of like people on the radio are just mumbling syllables and not really saying anything. Which of course I'm sort of making reference to the song Perks, which is literally kind of a middle finger to that sort of trait about like radio ready hip hop. The next album I want to talk about is Odetta Hartman, her second solo record, Old Rockhounds Never Die. Definitely a very interesting sort of fusion of folk, psychedelia, and indie music. It definitely is the kind of record that, even if you don't usually listen to like banjo heavy kind of music, like I certainly am one of those people who, isn't really big on the whole bluegrass thing or anything like that, but more sort of non-traditionalists who like their folk music kind of warped a little bit, definitely I think will find this album very appealing. Like, I really like kind of traditional folk music, but I do really like it when other artists try to like bend its edges as well, like what Miss Hartman is doing with this record over here. Probably my only issue with this record is, I do wish some of these songs were like elongated a little more. I mean, I don't mind how short they are, considering there are some really interesting transitions happening. I just, want them to be a little bit longer. That's one improvement I hope she makes with her next album, but still, definitely some very cool stuff going on here. And she's got a really cool voice, Voice, that will definitely stick out, and also the juxtaposition of different sounds does manage to really work together well. They're well. What's the next album? Oh yeah, the next album I want to talk about is a really good folk rock album that I actually wrote a review for my school newspaper, The Pulse, because I really liked it so much. The Goon Sax, Australian trio of 19-year-olds with We're Not Talking, which is their sophomore record, and definitely one of the better sort of indie pop records I've heard this year. They have such incredible skills for their age, like from the way they're able to sing really well to like their songwriting chops. I mean, these guys definitely have a very bright future ahead of them, and I hope their next record is more of a breakthrough than this record is. Because it definitely is a record that not a lot of there are some people that may not have heard of this band before, but definitely I hope in the near future they become a little more like well known with their next record, because they have such incredible skills, and I love their ability to sort of experiment with pop music's history a little bit, like sort of paying tribute to their influences while still kind of like playing from their hearts. And then a record that I think is pretty similar to that, but a little more stripped back and more sort of darker folk music, I would say, is Marissa Nadler, For My Crimes. Marissa Nadler is definitely a very talented Boston-based songwriter. This is the follow-up to her very gorgeous and very heavenly record, Strangers, from 2016. This record definitely kind of scales things back a little bit, but it allows her songwriting to improve and really shine much more, and she portrays that really well through her voice. And while the instrumentation on this album does sound simple, it's very like lush and like grand in the mix. Like the way that the strings kind of sweep in and out throughout this record is really gorgeous. And really does sort of tell a story along with her lyrics. And it features guest appearances from other singers like Angel Olsen, Sharon Van Etten, who recently put out a new record, along with Kristen Control from Dum Dum Girls. But they don't steal the show or anything. They're just some nice little kind of supporting sort of roles for this very beautiful record. I mean, like Angel Olsen's delivery on the opening title track definitely is really nice sort of subtlety over Nadler's lead vocal. Next, this is a record that some of you may have heard of because, you know, the Needle Drop is like super pumped for this record, and I know some of you were really like waiting for his review of this album very eagerly. That is Clarence Clarity, Think Peace. Definitely one of the most creative, and refreshing sort of electronic sort of R&B records I've heard this year. Some really cool vocals on this record. It definitely will appeal to those of you who really like, you know, that kind of LCD sound system type, kind of like indie dance music. This music and the production on this thing is just very grand and very lavish. And the way that this album flows is really cool. The way that there are certain songs that kind of there are parts of certain songs that kind of loop seamlessly throughout this record. I mean, there's even one track on here that's literally clips of different songs from this record, and yet it manages to create this really smooth sort of flow for this record. flow for this record, so I definitely am getting into this very kind of odd kind of electronic music, sort of electronic music. Electronic music, so definitely check that out. Two more records to cover. The next one I want to talk about is a really interesting jazz record that came out this year. Ambrose, Akinmusire, Origami Harvest. This record fuses together it's sort of like jazz, classical, and hip hop all mixed into this very tasteful sort of stew. Of course, the rap vocals are provided by Kool-Aid D, and the jazz grooves really do fit his kind of lyrical brain food really well. And there's some really beautiful string quartet arrangements on this record too that really do tell a story. I mean, I like how this is the kind of record where the instruments pretty much tell a story throughout. Like, there's points that are very beautiful, other points that are very melancholy, and then points that are just really, like, kind of angry and in your face as well. Definitely is a perfect record for this kind of, tumultuous kind of political state that we're sort of exposed to a lot. So it definitely is the kind of record that I think this record gives even Kamasi Washington's Heaven and Earth a run for its money, because it is that good and very ambitious. And finally, Anderson Paak, my dude from California, follows up his breakthrough album Malibu with Oxnard, his major label debut, and definitely a worthy follow-up. This record, Malibu, is definitely a very pop successful record, both critically and commercially. This one, doesn't seem to be quite as talked about as Malibu. It's maybe not necessarily as commercially successful, but it definitely does show that Anderson really is constantly improving as an artist. I mean, he really does hone in his skills as a rapper here on this record, and really does show how lucky he is to sort of be turning from kind of a couch surfing underground dude into one of hip hop's most sort of endearing and very unique sort of stars. Definitely some great songwriting on here. The features really did a great job on this record too. I mean, Pusha T, BJ the Chicago Kid, Dr. Dre, and Coco Saray, and of course Kendrick Lamar definitely did add a lot to this record too. So definitely one that I think definitely deserves a little more kind of. Deserves to have a little more press, a similar amount of attention that an album like Malibu has gotten. So yeah, that's it for my albums that I really like, that I think are some of the most underrated and overlooked records out in 2018. Hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully this video will inspire you to check out some of these albums if you haven't heard them yet, and I'll see you for my next album review next weekend.